You might ask yourself, well, how does labeling theory impact policy? What have we learned from labeling theory, and how have we changed what we do when we're thinking about incarceration of juveniles and that type of thing? Well, in the 70s, we see the rise in labeling theory, and we begin to question its impacts. The juvenile justice facilities and authorities and addressing these things in mental facilities, which we don't have a whole lot of anymore. Something that you might not understand is that in the 1950s and 60s, we had a lot of mental institutions. The book makes reference to the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and how mental institutions were essentially using labeling to construct their patients as mentally unfit, and then how those labels then created this, as we talked about earlier, this self-fulfilling prophecy. They noticed that consequential and negative nature of labeling was problematic, and in response to that, they began to rethink how to best serve populations affected. The deinstitutionalization of Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts is an example of this. They addressed the conditions of juvenile correctional facilities and closed the Massachusetts secure reform schools and moved to a system of alternative community treatment and placement for youths. The reason they closed the schools is because it was inevitable. Once the labeling was constructed, the caregivers in the facilities bought into the labels, and it was proving to be counterproductive, and the state of Massachusetts changes their policies. Once again, the idea of mental institutions and the problems associated with labeling, and the problems associated with institutionalizing people for a long period of time pushed the United States away from these types of mental institutions where someone can take their family member, or someone can be admitted into one of these mental institutions for help. And as we transition away from those, these mental institutions released a large number of what we would have considered prior to this move mentally unfit people for society back into society. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, that can be argued, but it was a thing. Of course, Edwin Schur in 1973 argues that non-intervention of young offenders can be problematic. This radical non-intervention or hands-off approach. So intervention was problematic, and Schur, with his research, says, well, if you just leave the kids alone wherever possible, that might be the best way for them to learn about deviance and then ultimately move away from it. So instead of allowing primary deviant acts to transform into secondary deviant acts, we just leave the kids alone and let them figure it out on their own, instead of starting a record labeling children which in turn leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy of more delinquent behavior in the future. According to Schur, much has changed. Systems today aim to re-socialize delinquent youth. That's a pretty minimal approach to what the systems are doing. We can see high incarceration rates throughout the U.S. history, and we know that punitive laws replaced the goal of rehabilitation. The three strikes you're out law, and just the expansion of the U.S. criminal justice system and prison system over the last 100 years is an indication that we're moving in the wrong direction in reference to this. Braithwaite's 2002 study is, of course, an argument for restorative justice. Braithwaite is arguing that the states function as an arbiter or partner who works with the victim and the offender to reduce the harm associated with the criminal act that has been committed is the central role of the state. They are not to be there as the punitive distributor of justice. They should be the restorative distributor of justice. According to Braithwaite's, the victims, offenders, and community members work together in a mediated conference to come to some sort of impasse or solution to the accused deviant acts. And of course, the goal is for offenders to take responsibility for their actions, and the group creates a consensus plan for the offenders to restore the harm that they caused. This idea is to not label for the long term, but to address where the deviant acts occurred, and then encourage the person that is responsible for the deviant act to take responsibility for it, and then to begin to reintegrate them into the community. Some criticisms of labeling theory. The early analysis did not show empirical support. It is focused on the process of constructing deviancy and not the individuals engaging in the acts. Some questions that we need to ask ourselves are how and under what circumstances the individual is judged as deviant when we're thinking about these criticisms, and what impact that judgment may have on his or her self-concept, relationships, opportunities, and life chances. Remember, this is the underlying essence of labeling theory, that once the label is put into place, it influences how the individuals see themselves and how the community that they're embedded in sees them, and then how they act in accordance to these new labels. Some conclusions on labeling theory. Labels are everywhere. We use labels to describe people. Stereotypes are very prominent in our society. These are convenient, helpful ways in categorizing complex relationships and interactions, even though they do have problems. The labeling perspective points out that labeling is consequential and potentially negative. This is the driving force of labeling theory in the first place. And studies from labeling and conflict theories reveal the importance of power and inequality in defining deviance, and they also reveal differential enforcement of norms and laws. Power matters. Those with power and wealth are not labeled deviants in a way that those without power and wealth are. So your social position is an extremely important factor in determining whether you will be deviant or not in the future. Some deviants on the street and in the suites. Remember, this is the book's way of showing you that deviance is not just a street level event. It happens with wealthier people as well. In this case, they're looking at binge drinking on college campuses and how that might be viewed as a form of elite deviance. Of course, fraternity parties, initiations, and sponsoring or in sporting events encourage alcohol consumption. This is a rite of passage. It's an indication that I come from a wealthier background and I can go to college, and all I have to do is drink the entire 4 years I'm in college, and that proves that I am from a higher social position because I don't really need to do what everybody else needs to do when they go to college. College town bars and other local businesses tend to profit from students' business, so they tolerate their unpleasant drunkenness. You can see this in almost every college town. There's some pushback that's coming in reference to this lately because of a lot of the sexual assault and date raping that is happening on college campuses, especially in reference to binge drinking. And ultimately, non-drinkers are often stigmatized, harassed, or ostracized, and they're seen as abnormal. Now, coming from a person that has not drank in 25 years, is an alcoholic, I do feel at times as if I am the abnormal person in my group. And when I feel that way, when my friends are becoming more and more intoxicated and the decibel levels in the room start to increase and the conversations, at least the ability to understand what these people are talking about decreases, then I really feel more and more like the deviant in the room. And when confronted with that, I choose to remove myself. When you're feeling as if your behavior, which is non-drunken behavior, is abnormal, well, then you just remove yourself from the situation and you wait for your friends to no longer be drunk, and you can be back interacting with them feeling as if you're normal with them once again. And the final slide of this presentation is looking at ideas in action. This particular example is I Have a Dream, which was started in 1981 by a millionaire, Eugene M. Lang. He was giving a speech at a 6th grade graduation in East Harlem. I believe this was the school that he originally went to. And he realized that labeling had a great impact, and maybe that if he engaged in a process of positive labeling, he might be able to change the low graduation rate that was plaguing these young kids in this East Harlem school. He wanted to give students a positive label. He called them dreamers, not to be confused with the DACA dreamers. And after he was told that 3/4 of the students would likely never finish high school, he decided that he would create a program that would help these individuals move through the public education system. And if they met all the criteria of the program, the carrot at the end of the stick would be his organization, his foundation would pay their entire college tuition. Before this was created in 1981, there was virtually no one doing this and no one receiving these opportunities. But in 1986, the I Have a Dream Foundation was started to address that problem. So he figures this out in 81, starts the foundation in 86, and today we've seen 15,000 students have now become dreamers. And this one program has expanded to 200 programs in 27 states. So this is one of those cases where it might seem as if the problems are insurmountable, but every 1,000 miles journey is began with one step. And in this case, the I Have a Dream Foundation was the first step for many of these kids.